I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
11 years ago this week, on the night before he died, Martin Luther King Jr. spoke those prophetic words in Memphis, Tennessee. Tonight, United Nations Ambassador Andrew Young remembers Martin Luther King and his legacy to America. I'm Bill Moyers. Andrew Young was Martin Luther King Jr.'s chief lieutenant in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the organization's executive director. An architect and strategist of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, he was also one of the frontline troops. He faced the police dogs and fire hoses in Birmingham, Alabama, was threatened, harassed, beaten, and jailed in Selma, and was with Dr. King in Memphis on that fateful day in April 1968 when the assassin struck. Andrew Young helped to draft and enact the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And then, in 1972, he ran for office himself, becoming the first black congressman from Georgia since Reconstruction. He was considered the diplomat of the civil rights movement. He could bring people together. And 2 years ago, President Carter named Andrew Young as the United States ambassador to the United Nations. Tonight, in a forum sponsored by District 1199 of the National Union of Hospital and Healthcare Employees as part of their Bread and Roses cultural project, Andrew Young remembers Martin Luther King. Did you ever talk to Martin Luther King about death, his death in particular?
He talked about death all the time, because you remember that he was stabbed in New York while signing copies of his book, Stride Toward Freedom, up in Harlem. And he always joked about it because he had the letter opener stuck in his heart, just pressing on the aorta of his heart. And they took him up to Harlem Hospital. And he remembers all of the clergy from Harlem gathering around his bed, praying for him. And he would always talk about how he could see them and knew what they were thinking, but that at that time he had no intention of going anywhere. He talked also about a little girl that sent him a letter, when a little white girl from somewhere in Pennsylvania who was about 10 years old, who read that this blade was pressed against the aorta of his heart, and said that if he had sneezed, it would have severed it and he would have bled to death. And she wrote him a simple postcard saying, "Dear Dr. King, I'm glad you didn't sneeze." And he talked about that very frequently. Death was very close to us all the time, and it was close to him because he said to us that we talk about death, but we weren't really prepared to face it. He said, every morning when I get up in the mirror and shave, there was the big scar where they had to open his chest to remove the knife. And he said, I have to face that scar every morning of my life. And he said, I've been there and I know what it's like. He said, you all don't know, but he would then mix this deep sense of tragedy with humor almost immediately. And he'd say, of course, if you go, and then he would lapse into what he would preach at my sermon.
What would he have preached at your...
Well, most of it was not fit for the public to know, because he would always tell about the little times that we did not quite live up to our expectations. He had a great sense of humor. And he would talk about the time, well, there was one time in particular that I had been in a group in Mississippi, in Canton, Mississippi, and we got him out of the way, and I stayed behind to try to direct the crowd. And I was up on the back of a truck when about 200 Mississippi State troopers started lobbing tear gas into this crowd, mostly of women and children. And I thought that I was going to brave it and be able to give instructions over the loudspeaker so that people would not run in the direction of the wind and all of the things that we'd been trained to do. And then all of a sudden the tear gas got me. I jumped down off the back of the truck thinking I was about to die, and just started running, jumping over women and children. And I finally reached a fence about 8 feet tall, a great big wick wire fence, and there was an elderly preacher just in front of me. And he cleared that fence, and I did too. And Martin would always refer back to the times that our humanity got the best of us.
Do you think James Earl Ray acted alone that night?
No, I don't. And I'll never believe that he did.
Did Martin Luther King ever talk about who might wish him dead?
Not really. He talked about the forces of evil. And at the time of President Kennedy's death, he never felt that President Kennedy's death was a single assassin. And he always felt that there were conspiratorial forces that did not understand him, that were afraid of what he was going to do or what he was doing. And he knew that some of them were in our government. In fact, the FBI.
Did he ever think that J. Edgar Hoover or somebody in the FBI might wish him dead?
Oh, he knew they wished him dead. And they went to great effort to destroy him politically. And all of this he was very much aware of. And he went to J. Edgar Hoover to try to talk to him about it. I met with Hoover and some of his associates.
What did you talk about?
Talked about their misunderstanding of our movement. They were accusing us of being communist. It's ironic because when people say the CIA didn't understand what was going on in Iran, the FBI didn't understand that there is, as our Declaration of Independence says, that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that it was out of this sense of inalienable rights and our own religious convictions that we were pursuing our own independence and freedom.
Did you tell Hoover that?
Sure.
What did he say?
Well, Hoover didn't give us much chance to talk. Hoover talked for about we were there for an hour, and Hoover talked for about 50 minutes. And basically, he was giving a justification of the FBI's not having any blacks, of the FBI's difficulties in working in Mississippi. He told us then to, you see, the big public break came because Martin criticized the FBI for not finding the killers of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner.
In Mississippi?
In Mississippi in 1964. And that infuriated Hoover, and he made the statement about Martin being the most notorious liar in the world or something.
But even before that, Andy, Hoover had put Martin Luther King on a list of people to be rounded up in the case of a national emergency. He had referred to him as garbage. He had talked about him as a dangerous man. Why do you think Hoover felt that enmity toward King?
I don't know, but in the early days, we didn't know that. And in an ironic sort of way, we thought of the FBI as our friends. Because you have to remember that in the early 60s or late 50s, the FBI was the federal government. And they, in spite of the fact that they were reactionary, maybe even fascist in points, they did respond to the federal government. The state Bureau of Investigation, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, was in cahoots with the Ku Klux Klan. The local sheriffs were there beating on us and throwing us in jail. The FBI was the only hope we had. We called up the FBI. We gave them instructions on, we told them exactly what we were doing. We operated under the Gandhian notion that there should be no secrets, that we wanted the world to know that this is what we were going to do, this is why we were going to do it, and we would keep them informed. But they never believed it. We even invited them into some of our meetings in places.
They already were there and you didn't know it.
Well, I'm not sure they were there.
You don't think they were there?
No, because They had a very hard time getting informers to inform accurately. The informers within the movement basically were informing for the money, and they were telling the FBI what they wanted to hear. And I've read some of the FBI reports, and most of the stuff they got from informers they could have gotten from the newspapers.
Did he feel resentment over the fact that the Justice Department, with White House approval, was tapping his telephones and bugging his rooms because of fear that the communists were trying to influence him?
He didn't feel that way because President Kennedy told him he was doing it. When they went to, in one of the visits during the time of the March on Washington, President Kennedy took him alone out into the Rose Garden and told him that he'd had these complaints from Hoover and from Senator Eastland, and that he had authorized them. Well, he didn't say he had authorized it. He said, "I want you to know that people are monitoring every move you make." And Martin said, well, he's aware of that, and he's glad that the president felt free to tell him that. And then Martin came back and said, the president told me that they were monitoring me, but in order to tell me that, he took me out in the Rose Garden, so he must know they're monitoring him too.
What was the last thing he said to you?
Well, I don't know. It was, I had been in court all day. And we came back from court, and I'd been on the witness stand about trying to lift the injunction that would enable us to march with the garbage workers in Memphis. And I hadn't called in all day. So when I went back to his room, everybody was gathered, and he immediately started fussing in a rather kind of joking way about why don't you call and let me know what's going on? We're sitting here all day long waiting to hear from you, and you didn't call. And he picked up a pillow and threw it at me. And I threw it back, and we ended up with 5 or 6 of us in a pillow fight. I mean, he was in a, he was in, occasionally he would get in those kinds of hilarious moods. And then we sat down and we began to talk about what was going on in the trial. We were on our way out to dinner, and we realized that it was just about 6 o'clock, and Reverend Billy Kiles from Memphis was supposed to be taking us over to his house. So Martin and Ralph left and went up to their room to get ready for dinner. And I stayed down in the courtyard and waited, and that was really about the last thing we had to say.
Let's go back to the beginning. It is very hard in 1979 for many Americans to remember what it was like for a black person in the 40s and 50s. Can you recall those times?
Sure. I think that it depended on where you were. I grew up in New Orleans, and New Orleans was always a bit more cosmopolitan than most other parts of the South. So I always think of myself as having been somewhat sheltered. But as soon as you left the city limits of New Orleans, or as soon as you went across a state line in Mississippi or in Georgia, that was still an era of lynching. That anything blacks did that whites did not approve, blacks suffered the consequences. And that consequences were quite often beatings, jailings for no reason at all, the kind of thing that you saw on Roots very dramatically portrayed. My parents always told me that, you're black, you can't be 90% right, because if you're the least bit wrong, you're in trouble. You've got to be 200% right.
When did you first meet Martin Luther King?
I first met Martin Luther King when I was pastoring in Thomasville, Georgia, and he was pastoring in Montgomery in about 1956. And we were both on a program at Talladega College in Alabama. We were on a panel together.
What was your impression?
Well, I don't remember being that impressed. I wanted to be impressed, but I also think I wanted to impress him.
This was after the Montgomery boycott.
The Montgomery bus boycott was in process. And we, Jean, my wife, and Coretta, his wife, grew up in the same little town in Alabama. So we drove from Talladega back to Montgomery and had dinner with them, and then we went on to my wife's home in Marion, Alabama. And we sat around talking, and I knew he had written his PhD thesis, a dissertation, on Paul Tillich. And I had read a lot of Paul Tillich, and I had been fortunate enough to meet Dr. Tillich up here in New York, and I wanted to talk about, theology. And he wasn't interested. It was, we ended up having a nice little chat, talking about family and children. We made no comments about the social situation, nothing profound. But that's basically the way he was. He was a most unpretentious human being.
Somebody called him about that time, a man curiously at rest, even somnolent, a man beyond jubilation, who's seen it all before and knew it would happen. How do you describe that? Was there something indifferent or otherworldly about him?
No, I think he really was very much in love with life. And he appreciated children and old people. I remember the first time I met him in Ebenezer Church, after I accepted a job to come to work with him, one of the old ladies in the church had brought a pan of neck bones. And by this time, he was been on the cover of Time magazine, was nationally known, and he and his father were sitting there with a napkin in their neck, and they were sucking on these neck bones. And the old lady was sitting there with, sitting around, and they were having just a very down-to-earth conversation. And I think he made no distinctions between people. He was not interested in their wealth or their education. He saw straight through to the heart of a human being. And that was where he tried to relate to people.
How do you explain the phenomenon that Martin Luther King, this curiously laid-back person, this man happy to be a pastor, became the national symbol of the civil rights movement and not one of these others?
I think that was the key to it, that he didn't want it. I think the black community and ordinary black people generally are very suspicious of, ambition and anything that smacks of self-aggrandizement. He was so basically humble and unassuming, and yet he was so obviously talented. The man would become transformed once he got behind a pulpit. They could see the brilliance of his leadership. And even in that first speech in 1955, the first night of the bus boycott, when he didn't want to be the leader and he didn't know what he was going to say, if you read back through the outline of that speech, there was a vision of what America should be. And there was an understanding that somehow the American dream had to be fulfilled, and that perhaps there was a special destiny for black Americans to fulfill that.
Where do you think that came from, that sense of a destiny?
I think that came from his family and his church, and basically the Bible. Black Americans adopted, particularly the Old Testament, and he understood the period of, his sermon about the Promised Land was going back to Moses leading the children of Israel out of Egypt, marching in the wilderness for 40 years, and then going into the Promised Land. Black Americans understood slavery, and they understood freedom. And in fact, nobody understands freedom like somebody who has known slavery and been threatened by it. And so, going back to the Declaration of Independence, he was endowed by his Creator with certain inalienable rights and the ability to articulate these to others in such a way that they could understand and follow. You know, for years, I would say during the 30s and 40s, there were communist organizers in the South trying to stir up the black community. Organized labor had attempted to organize in the South and had failed miserably, largely because there was very little response from the black community. The thing that the black community responded to was a cultural idiom that they were very much a part of. All of the songs that we sang were the songs of slavery. We twisted the words sometime just a little bit. We sang them with a new meaning and relevance. But basically, he put a political movement in the context of black culture and tradition.
April 1963, Martin Luther King brings that crusade to Birmingham, Alabama.
God has spoken to me. And I'm not going to run from the responsibility. May mean going through the floods and through the waters, but I'm going if it means that. May mean going through the storms and through the winds, but I'm going if it means that. May mean going to jail, but I'm going if it means that. It may even mean physical death, but if it means that I will die standing up for the freedom of my people. God has spoken to me.
What did Martin Luther King mean when he said, God has spoken to me?
I think that Martin always felt that he had a special purpose in life, and that that purpose in life was something that was given to him by God, that he was the son and grandson of Baptist preachers, and he understood, I think, the scriptural notion of men of destiny. He talked about Moses and of Abraham, and he understood, I think, that the cross or the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth was an event which was not only a cosmic theological event, but I think he saw that as a social and political event which could continually reoccur.
What was it he said often? Unearned suffering is the most redemptive.
That's right.
Suffering.
He said, as I guess St. Augustine quite often said, that there's no remission of sins without the shedding of blood.
What made Birmingham special?
I think Birmingham was special because everything came together. It was the first time that people by the thousands went to jail. The 300,000 black citizens and many white citizens refused to purchase anything during that 3 or 4 month period, which meant that the town was economically drying up.
1963.
1963. And the businessmen then, under the leadership of Attorney General Robert Kennedy and Burke Marshall, were organized in a committee of 100 to begin to negotiate with us in that to try to find some way to reconcile. You start out with investigation, negotiation, demonstration, come back to negotiations as a means of reconciliation. And the things we were trying to get were so simple. We were simply trying to get the right to eat at a lunch counter. We were simply asking each of the stores in downtown Birmingham to hire one clerk. We were asking supermarkets to allow black people to run the cash register. We were asking the Board of Education to begin to submit a plan for desegregation of public schools. And it was a very simple list.
But yet the business community did not want to negotiate.
They did not want to negotiate, and for the year prior to, or during the 3 or 4 months prior to our movement, there had been 50 bombings of black homes and churches in Birmingham by people who wanted to try to scare us into staying out of there. In the beginning, before we went to Birmingham, we planned it very well. Dr. King came up here and spent an evening with Harry Belafonte at his home, and Harry pulled together a number of people here in New York, and they committed to raise bond money for us. They raised several $100,000. And we went back then with the support we had from Harry and some of his friends to get the movement going. And by that time, we had spent up all the bond money, and we still had about 300 or 400 people in jail with no way to get them out. So some people said to Martin, you have to go back up north and raise some more money to get these people out of jail. Some of the rest of us said, no, we need to all go to jail, and maybe you need to lead us. And he went back and forth on that all day long. And then finally, in the middle of the day, decided that he was going to go on to jail and see what the end would be. And it was after that time when he went in jail, that the clergy, the white clergy of Birmingham, put an ad in the paper condemning him for being an outside agitator and a communist and stirring up trouble. And it was a whole-page ad, really very venomous. And he sat down and he started writing an answer to them. And they wouldn't give him any paper, so he wrote it around the margins of the newspapers that he brought in, and he wrote on all the toilet paper in the jail cell. And he turned out this letter from the Birmingham jail that really articulated the whole spirit of the movement and got worldwide circulation almost immediately. Well, that day that he went to jail was Good Friday. That following Sunday, he never would let me go to jail with him because he always figured that I needed to stay out to stay in touch with him and the press.
And raise bond money.
And, no, we'd given up on bond money, sent other folk to jail. And so we decided we were going to march down to the jail on Easter Sunday just to have a word of prayer with him. And up to now, we had had only a few hundred, mostly old people and very young people. The first man to go to jail in Birmingham was 78 years old. But we didn't get the middle class and middle-aged. We got the 15, 16-year-olds and the 60 and 70-year-olds. And it was an interesting combination because these old people with the history and heritage of the faith made jail a religious experience. Part of the ritual was to have prayer services 3 times a day and Bible study. And so these older people in jail with these young children leading Bible study and singing these old hymns really created quite an experience, so that the kids who would come out of jail had such a powerful spiritual experience. They not only wanted to go back, they wanted to take their friends back with them. And so a couple of things happened about that time. We had it was the first time that masses of people showed up to take part in a demonstration. There were only 55 people that went to jail with Martin Luther King when he went. It wasn't a popular thing. But that Sunday, about 7,000 or 8,000 people showed up at the New Pilgrim Baptist Church to march to the jail. And Bull Connor was standing there along with his fire hoses and trucks and police dogs. And when we walked up to Bull Connor, he told us to go back, and we asked everybody to get down on their knees. And they got down on their knees in their Easter Sunday go to meetings, and somebody just started praying. And these old chants, traditional chants of the black community, and people were moaning and crying and praying, and I was trying to talk with Bull Connor to convince him that we just wanted to go to the jail to have a word of prayer with Martin Luther King and turn around and come back. He was totally difficult and said he was going to throw us all in jail. And all of a sudden, some old lady got up and said, "God is with this movement. We going on to the jail." And she got up and everybody started walking, and there were these firemen with these hoses that if they turned them on, the pressure from that close distance would have broken people's ribs. And Bull Connor was hollering, "Stop them, stop them." And these firemen, who were the traditional racists of Birmingham, who really didn't know any better, had been so moved by this experience that, you know, they just let the hoses drop to their feet. They never turned them on. The dogs that had been straining at the leash, you know, jumping at us, all of a sudden just stopped. And we walked right on through. And somebody hollered, "Great God Almighty, and parted the Red Sea one more time." It was that kind of combination of economic and spiritual force that I think made the movement what it was.
When Birmingham ended, did Martin Luther King believe it had been a success?
Yeah, it was a tremendous success, and it led us to the March on Washington.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream. My 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today.
What do you think now of that moment?
It was an extremely prophetic moment. And I tell you, I thought of it just last week when I was in Mississippi. I was speaking at a statewide meeting of the NAACP, and the governor of Mississippi sat next to me at the dinner table and then made me an honorary Mississippi colonel. And I see the thing that Martin dreamed about and prophesied to some extent happening in the South. The 2 new senators from Alabama. You visit them and their offices are more integrated than the Northern liberal offices. You have to remember that it was Mississippi that was the state that cast the final ballot that elected Jimmy Carter president. And I remember about 4 o'clock in the morning waiting, and when Mississippi won by 11,000 votes, a number of us shouted, you know, the hands that picked the cotton have finally picked the president. There are many things that I never dreamed would happen in the South that now are part of everyday life. And I never cease to be amazed when I go back to some of those areas at the tremendous amount of progress that has been made socially and politically.
But what about the North? Why has the North been so much harder to crack?
The North has been harder to crack in part because it didn't realize it had a problem. And back in the early 60s, and further back than that, people up north thought that we were enslaved and they were free up here. The other problem is they did have certain social and political freedoms, but there was a very sophisticated kind of economic enslavement. But even in the North, I think, you've got to say that there's been tremendous progress. The problem is that it has been progress for only a small part of the population. When I visit northern college campuses, or more particularly the city college campuses in the North, the number of young black and brown people now that are in college and getting advanced education, that was not true before 1968. In fact, it was in response to Martin's assassination that the colleges of the nation opened up and realized that they had a responsibility to educate the minorities. And they've done, I think, a pretty fair job of it. You see in the business community, those young people who have had the benefits of college and graduate education. It's hard to go to a law firm now that doesn't have a few black lawyers.
But you're talking about basically an elite among
exactly
the blacks.
And so those blacks who have had basic educational skills met have been able to go on and take their place in the society and do quite well. The problem is that there were many, many people, in fact, the larger percentage of people in the North, who had come up from the South without certain basic skills and have never been able to find a place in the society.
Some people look back and see the March on Washington as the beginning of the end of that phase of the civil rights movement which Martin Luther King dominated. In the summer of 1964, when there were riots here in Harlem, he came north, and he was booed by people in Harlem as a missionary of the establishment. When you all went to Chicago, you retreated en route, in a sense, as the mobs attacked and somebody said Chicago was King's Waterloo. Do you agree with that?
I really don't. I agree that he had problems coming into New York, not because he was not welcome in New York, but there was a mistake made. He was brought here by the establishment, and instead of the establishment talking to local black leaders, they sent for him. Now, immediately he was then rejected by the local leaders, but as soon as he had an opportunity to meet with the local leaders, that all turned around, including the support that was received from Malcolm X, who really did the job in 1964 of moving through the streets of Harlem, talking to people about not burning and looting.
What did Martin Luther King think of Malcolm X?
Thought he was a tremendously intelligent and dedicated human being.
Why didn't they ever really join league effectively?
He always felt that they could not be on the same platform.
Why?
Because Malcolm always said that I make it possible for you to make progress. He said, if there's not the threat of violence, people won't listen to your nonviolence.
Do you think that's true?
To some extent. But Martin always felt that Malcolm was not, Malcolm never did anything violent in his life. Nobody can find a single incident of Malcolm telling anybody to do anything but defend themselves. And Martin said that very much the same way, except that Martin had an aggressive kind of nonviolence, and Malcolm talked about essentially defensive violence.
What did Martin Luther King think about the political and social realities of the North?
Well, you see, we never wanted to write off Mayor Daley. And the big problem we had with Chicago blacks was that they tended to personalize the struggle. They had a movement to get rid of Willis, the school superintendent. They were fighting the Daley machine. We had always avoided that in the South. We said we are not after changing people. We are anxious to change the relationship between people. So we were not trying to get rid of the politicians. We were trying to really convert the politicians. Now, they didn't believe that was possible in the North. But Mayor Daley had supported us in Birmingham. And one of the biggest fundraisers we had for Birmingham was something that Mayor Daley and Mahalia Jackson put together. And so we could never think of Mayor Daley as an enemy. We saw him as a political leader with a different set of responsibilities, but we never could quite get the black community to accept that analysis of Chicago politics.
Why?
Partially, the black community was being led by white liberals in the Illinois voter reform movement, IVI, Independent Voters of Illinois. They were really anti-machine, and for good reason. We saw the machine as having been created in essence by a black congressman, Congressman Dawson. And so we thought it was possible to reclaim that machine and take it over. And so we never quite got our agendas together there.
But you don't think Chicago was, as somebody has called it, a Waterloo?
No, I don't, because when we left Chicago, we had an agreement that ultimately, I think, continued the black community and the power structure working together. As much as, truthfully, we probably got more out of Chicago than we got out of Birmingham, except that in Birmingham, it was followed up by federal legislation. In Chicago, we didn't get the federal legislation, in part because of the war in Vietnam.
Martin Luther King was one of the first national leaders to speak out against the war in Vietnam. His words stirred controversy among followers as well as adversaries.
I come to participate in this significant demonstration today because my conscience leaves me no other choice. I join you in this mobilization because I cannot be a silent onlooker while evil rages. I refuse to despair. Before we win the victory for peace, some of us will be misunderstood and called bad names. Some will have to suffer. Some will be thrown into jail cells. But we must go on with the faith that we can win the victory for peace in this world and bring an end to the war in Vietnam.
Over the past 2 years, as I have moved to break the betrayal of my own silences and to speak from the burnings of my own heart, as I have called for radical departures from the destruction of Vietnam, many persons have questioned me about the wisdom of my path. At the heart of their concerns, this query has often loomed large and loud. Why are you speaking about the war, Dr. King? Why are you joining the voices of dissent? Peace and civil rights don't mix, they say. Aren't you hurting the cause of your people, they ask. And when I hear them, though I often understand the source of their concern, I'm nevertheless greatly saddened, for such questions mean that the inquirers have not really known me, my commitment or my calling.
You really did know him. What did he mean by that?
Well, he meant that the nation couldn't go on. He quoted President Kennedy about war, that either mankind will put an end to war or war will put an end to mankind. He said he couldn't segregate his conscience and be for justice at home for black people and tolerate injustice for yellow and brown people in Vietnam. He said that Vietnam and China were historic enemies, and there was no need to have American men and women engaged in a war to prevent a monolithic communist expansion. We see now with the invasion of China by Vietnam and the war between China and Vietnam that he was right. He said that you couldn't have guns and butter, that if you continued to spend hundreds of billions of dollars, we were spending almost $2 million a minute in Vietnam. And one of the reasons why we have inflation now, I'm convinced, is the war in Vietnam.
I remember when he first came out against the war, President Johnson, to put it mildly, was agitated. He stormed around the office and demanded, "What is that preacher doing to me?" We gave him the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We gave him the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We gave him the war on poverty. What more does he want? What was his reaction to that kind of response from the president?
Well, interestingly enough, he never blamed President Johnson for the war in Vietnam. And I always contend that if President Johnson had decided to run, Martin Luther King may have even supported him.
In 1968?
Yeah. Because he again, I said, he did not blame the person. He was fighting the situation. He wasn't fighting President Johnson. He never publicly criticized President Johnson. And when they talked over the phone, President Johnson, he saw President Johnson as trying to lead a moderating course between the people who wanted to put more and more weaponry in Vietnam and those who just wanted to abandon. And he kept trying to tell President Johnson that this was a no-win situation, and the wisest thing to do was would be to get out. Whenever they talked, they always had a very friendly conversation. But after a while, I think President Johnson got angry and would no longer talk. And he began to take his case to other black leaders. And that was where where Martin and the student movement then began to reunite. Because the student movement was out against the war in Vietnam long before we were. And they started out in late 64, early 65. It was toward the end of 65 before we made our first statements against the war, and that was 68 before Martin himself got involved.
Howard DeWolf once wrote about the tremendous spiritual turmoil that Martin Luther King underwent in this time when he was trying to make up his mind about Vietnam. Do you remember that turmoil?
I did, and he went through a long period of prayer and fasting. He fasted a lot. He never talked about it, but he would just go without any food and perhaps drink water, occasionally fruit juice. And he'd stay up and read and think, and he'd talk to people.
Did he know that this position he was about to take conceivably could wreck the civil rights movement, alienate the White House, alienate the government, alienate the hawks on Vietnam who might be doves on civil rights?
Well, that was his big problem, because Roy Wilkins and Whitney Young felt that we needed President Johnson. And they pleaded with him not to break with the president on Vietnam because we needed the president on domestic issues. And I'd say that held him up for almost a year. He agreed with them, and he tried to avoid getting involved. He even went so far as to ask Coretta to read up on the war in Vietnam, and she'd been very active in Women's Strike for Peace and International League for Peace and Freedom, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and she would make most of the speeches on Vietnam that he was invited to make because he wanted to try to keep these two movements separate. But then he realized that you just couldn't do it.
It has been 15 years now since Martin Luther King talked about the end of racism, poverty, and war in his Nobel Prize speech. What do you think he would say now of our progress toward ending war, racism, and poverty?
Well, I think that he would be tremendously impressed at the progress we've made on racism. And I know that's hard for some people to realize, but they don't remember where we were. I always remember where we were. And just simple things, like I would never see a black person on an airplane in the late 50s. Now, air travel is totally integrated. And so you know that there are a lot of black people more fully participating in the American way of life than before. It's very hard to go to a business where you don't find some black people working. It's hard to find a totally segregated school system anymore. Some of the northern cities still have some problems, but if you go down south in rural Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia, schools are thoroughly integrated. He would be very impressed with that level of progress. I think he would be impressed with the political progress. the presence of black mayors in Atlanta and Detroit and Gary, Indiana, Los Angeles. I think, too, that he would be terribly concerned about the problems of the poorest of the poor.
Yeah, I just was about to bring up the Vernon Jordan's recent annual report for the Urban League, saying that the condition of black America is almost disastrous. In fact, he said black America stands on the brink of disaster. 1 out of every 4 qualified workers is unemployed. The jobless rate for teenagers is up far above what it was even 10 years ago. Blacks have lost much of the gain they made in income in the last 10 years. What do you think Martin Luther King would be doing about the condition of black America if he were alive today?
Well, I think for one thing, he'd be far more involved in politics. In fact, the week before he was assassinated, we had a meeting here in New York, again with Harry Belafonte and Dick Hatcher and some others, to talk about organizing what he said was a predominantly black institution within the Democratic Party to stimulate further political participation. He always saw politics as a means of dealing with the additional economic problems.
Do you think if he had lived, he would have run for office himself?
I don't think so. In fact, all of us felt that it was not our job to run for office, that it was our job rather to support others in running for office. And perhaps if he had lived, I wouldn't have run for office either. I would have been working with other candidates to get them elected.
When you ran in 1970, you said that the power in America to change things was in the political structure. Where today is the power in America to change things?
I think still very much in the political structure. And so long as we have voted and voted well, we find changes. I think the problems, one of the problems that the black community faces right now is that there was a fairly low turnout of black voters in the November '78 elections. And part of the wavering that I think we see in the Congress is because black voters didn't vote. Of course, I like to warn the Congress that black voters are going to vote in the 1980 election, so they'll be judged by a quite different constituency than the one that turned out in 1978.
Would it be fair to say that the civil rights movement that Martin Luther King inspired and guided for so long has finished, that that phase of the struggle is over?
I don't think so. Well, I shouldn't say I don't think so. Let me say that I think that those techniques and tactics will always be relevant. I think there are many, many people who still need that kind of involvement. Take, for instance, Cesar Chavez and the farm workers. They're doing very much amongst Mexican Americans what we were doing amongst blacks in the 60s. I think SCLC is now talking with the sugar workers in southern Louisiana. In those areas, there's a tremendous amount that has to be done. I think organized labor, as it seeks to organize the working poor, is going to begin to use many of those tactics and techniques and ought to do it. But I think we've got to realize, as Martin realized before his death, that it's going to be more difficult because the problems are economic. They cost money, and they require the generation of wealth or the redistribution of wealth in a way that political and social changes of the 60s never required.
In one of his essays, Martin Luther King told of a young black man who was the first black man to die in the gas chamber in a southern state. It was about 1938, and as the gas curled upward, the people who were observing could hear the young man say, "Save me, Joe Louis. Save me, Joe Louis. Save me, Joe Louis." And Dr. King said those words spoke the despair, the hopelessness, and the loneliness of the black. That when this young man was reaching out for someone to rescue him, someone to care, he turned not to God, not to government, not to white liberals, but to the heavyweight boxing champion of the world. Joe Louis would care because Joe Louis was black. Who is there now?
I hope there are a lot of people. And I think that Coleman Young in Detroit has certainly responded very much as a brown bomber in redeeming that city, which is Joe Louis' hometown. I think Maynard Jackson in Atlanta. I think Dutch Morial in New Orleans, and Ken Gibson in Newark. And then in the civil rights movements, I think Vernon Jordan and Ben Hooks. Jesse Jackson has had a phenomenal way of inspiring and motivating young children to take control of their own education. I hope, in fact, one of the reasons I say things that are as controversial as they are is that I think I'm saying things that are relevant to black people who want to hear the truth and don't care who it hurts.
What then was Martin Luther King's legacy?
I think that's it. I think his legacy was that without violence, we could make this system work. We could, by the spiritual and cultural power of ourselves as a people, and by the religious power, we could make this system do what it promised to do in its Constitution. We could make the courts work. We could make the politics work. We could make the economic system serve our needs. And we could find a way not only to do this for ourselves, but to do it for people all over the world. Because Martin always understood that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So he was concerned about Jews in the Soviet Union. He was concerned about people in Vietnam. He was concerned about people in South Africa or in Nicaragua or Iran. And I think that he would tell us now, yes, be concerned about yourself, but don't ever get so concerned about yourself that you forget to be concerned about others. Because very much in the way of Jesus of Nazareth, he who would find his life must lose it for my sake.
For a transcript of this program, send $2 to Bill Moyer's Journal, Post Office Box 900, New York, New York, 10019. This program was made possible by grants from the Ford Foundation and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Actress Jane Fonda discusses the China Syndrome on The Dick Cavett Show next.
This is the story of a happy family. Father, mother, and 3 sons. They all went to church. The boys played baseball. All were active in their community, not uncommon in the town of Montvale, New Jersey. Until early one Sunday morning, the oldest son shot them all. Bill Moyer's Journal brings you the story of the regrettable death of a family.
An American tragedy, sensitively reported by Bill Moyers 1 week from tonight at 9.
The Scarlet Letter, the passionate story of Hester Prynne. A brilliant American cast brings a great American novel to life.
Hester Prynne pleads to keep her baby in Part 2 of The Scarlet Letter tomorrow night at 9.